joining us today.
Todavía. Cuando yo quite la placa, esa es tu señal, ¿sí?
You will begin once I remove the slide, so we will start again.
Muy buenos días a todas las
A very good
personas.
morning to all of you who are joining us this morning. It is a pleasure to welcome you so that we can talk about intercultural dialogues. This is a strategy that has been proposed by PAHO from the Office for Gender and Diversity. This has been organized by PAHO. However, there is somebody else speaking at this time. Now, the United Nations Organization for Food and Agriculture, FAO, and the Indigenous Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean have contributed and will be with us. And we also have the Andean Health Organization joining us today. Now, the purpose of this meeting is that we have a space for reflection so that we see intercultural health within the context of the pandemic, and that we see this in terms of intercultural dialogues within the region. We also want to recognize a number of the initiatives that are being implemented with strategic partners and allies who are with us today. And this will allow us to maximize our efforts and strengthen collaboration for purposes of improving the health situation of groups which are most vulnerable. So I would like now to open up the meeting to the panel, and I would warmly welcome Gabriel Muyui, who is the technical secretariat of his organization. Welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everyone. I thank all of the colleagues and the colleagues from the United Nations who have come to organize this very important event, the launching of a methodology for intercultural dialogue. It is a knowledge exchange, and we've been seeing it also looking at scientific knowledge, but we also look at traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples, as well as all the different forms of knowledge that comes from academia and the laboratories. The fact of the matter is that we're very much pleased to be a part of this activity. And I apologize on behalf of our president, who was not able to join us today, but he certainly extends greetings on behalf of FILAC. From the perspective of FILAC, this is an intergovernmental organization. It is a parity organization, and we are a part of the technical team and all of those who represent governments and who provide assistance to indigenous peoples. So the work itself has been teaching us and guiding us as to the importance of intercultural dialogue, a dialogue of knowledge. This is all important to all of us. And to give you an example, a wise indigenous person from the Amazon basin knows how to deal with his reality in the jungle, knows what to do with the different animals, with the snakes. He knows what to do in risk situations. And if scientist from Harvard or the University of Paris comes into the Amazon, we're sure that that person won't survive a day. We know that the indigenous leader who is familiar with traditional medicine will know what to do if someone is bitten by a snake and knows what to do in X or Y situation and can do this without needing any training in New York or in Paris. And we don't want this knowledge to disappear. So the idea is to bring together the different experiences, the different realities. This is very important. I would say that also in regard to food, because as we know, this is very important when we relate it to health. People who get sick are not well nourished, or maybe they're drinking non-potable water. So the person who best knows how to grow corn or beans or quinoa is the neighbor who works with these products every year, knows much more than any trained agronomist. So any expert who was trained at the university, and many of them are indigenous people, but many of these can supplement the knowledge. Both are important. The indigenous knowledge, which for thousands of years has been inheriting knowledge as to how to produce quinoa, but there are also books as to how all of these different crops are grown: potatoes, corn, quinoa. So as a part of this intercultural dialogue, and as a part of an exchange of scientific knowledge, we want to set up teams that complement one another. Now, it can be somebody who has a doctorate in a certain field. This person can contribute to the community, can also share values. And the person without the doctorate may also have knowledge regarding food and health. So welcome to this exercise, to this work, which has been organized by the Pan American Health Organization and your organizations. And we as FILAC are pleased to join you because we believe that we all want to solve problems. There are very difficult problems that we are looking at the world today: climate change, reduction of biodiversity, water access, the COVID problem, which has not ended. This will not be resolved by a single person or a single institution. We need to coordinate our efforts. We need to join our knowledge, scientific and technical. And we need to bring in traditional knowledge as well from the indigenous peoples to contribute to society. So with this, we are certain that we will have a methodology, an instrument that provides us with a vision of the future as well as with a strategic vision. So thank you very much, Sandra, friends at PAHO and the OAS. Thank you all for these efforts. Today, more than ever, the world and humanity needs to come together. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. We heard from the technical secretary of FILAC, Gabriel Muyuy. Now, I would now like to present a video and give the floor to the permanent chair for Indigenous Matters. With the video, please. Distinguished panelists and participants, Indigenous brothers and sisters, I appreciate the invitation to participate at this dialogue. The question of health of Indigenous peoples is very important and it requires urgent action. the COVID-19 pandemic manifested how a lack of recognition of our health systems led to negative consequences for our people. Nevertheless, at the same time, we saw how these unique and holistic health systems of indigenous peoples, together with innovation, allowed for a mitigation of the impacts of the pandemic when it came to the loss of human life, as well as the seriousness of the disease. I take this opportunity to extend greetings and congratulate the building of a dialogue of knowledge, which has been promoted by the Pan American Health Organization with the participation of indigenous people. With this, we can build up an intercultural health system. These initiatives, which we see as positive, and we appeal to have them replicated so that we can continue to have a methodology and a dialogue in the health sector, in the region, and together with the representatives of the indigenous peoples. I believe that as a part of this dialogue of knowledge, we also need a political dialogue. So we need to think of having a continental summit of health ministers together with indigenous leaders in order to have a focus which ensures and guarantees health. We need a paradigm shift in terms of the dominant approach to health which exists today. In other words, we need to move to a person-centered focus with rights, and we need to focus we need to move from the person to the community. We need to look at nature and our land. This is the approach that has been implemented by indigenous people for thousands of years. In addition to promoting joint planning, there need to be legal reforms and there need to be national policies which are culturally appropriate, recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples to health within a framework of predetermination. All of this requires a budget which is sufficient for implementation of these programs. I am certain that with this task, state authorities in coordination with the indigenous peoples, as well as international agencies such as PAHO, FAO, among others, can play a definitive role in this paradigm shift. So I appeal to the strengthening of coordination among agencies to maximize the efforts and extend the work on dialogues of knowledge to different social cultural regions, going beyond the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. Here, the World Health Organization has a presence. So thank you very much for your attention. I wish you some constructive work, and I hope we continue with this link with these processes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone who has opened the event, and I also thank the Permanent Forum, and thank you for collaborating with the work being done by PAHO, as well as all of the other agents participating. We will now enter into our conversation, and we will talk about how we have been building intercultural health within the context of the pandemic, and how we use the knowledge dialogue. And I would like to introduce the distinguished panelists who will be with us today. They have all collaborated with PAHO for many years in different contexts. We will be able to hear from Jessica Ortega, who represents the Coordinated Committee of Indigenous People in the region, Gloria Lagos, who manages strategic lines and international cooperation of the Andean Health Organization, Mirna Cunningham, who is the first vice president of FILAC. And on behalf of FILAC, we also have thoughts offered by Dali Angel, who is in charge of the youth program. We also have Roberto Rosca with us, who is head of vulnerable groups in the social department of the OAS. And we've been working with him for many years, not only in terms of indigenous populations, but also Afro-descendants. And we also have Adrian Diaz, who is a family evaluator within PAHO in Ecuador. We also have our colleague from FAO, John Fernandez, who will join us today. But before kicking off with a question for our panelists, I have some thoughts.
We would like to make a few comments on the methodology that PAHO wants to launch today. This is not something new. These are methodologies that have been working for very long. PAHO considered it very relevant even before the pandemics, because there was previous work that was done even before the arrival of COVID-19, which was focused on this matter. And the idea was to present and position a methodology would observe and take into account of how the dialogue of knowledges has been implemented in the different contexts and different countries of the region, and also a methodology that would be applicable to different situations where groups are culturally diverse or may have some differences. PAHO has launched the methodology and the dialogue of knowledges, and also the manual for facilitators. We're going to be talking and coordinating with the people who have joined us, but we'd like to stress that the final objective is to have an impact on different groups and obtain and improve the outcomes of those groups that are more vulnerable. With the arrival of the pandemic, we have been able to have this reflection of how it's increasingly becoming more important to have differentiated approaches and specific approaches that would put on the table what the different perspectives are, as well as the different knowledges of the different peoples living in a region, so we can achieve good or more favorable health results and outcomes. We would also like to emphasize the importance of having inclusive approaches. And in this regard, I would like to ask Mirna Cunningham, who is here with us and who's been working with PAHO since the 90s. Yesterday, in fact, we were remembering during a panel about non-contagious diseases and the long path that we have followed, and that where we have had this important support to build this intercultural health. Mirna, PAHO is aware of the importance of the intercultural approach in intercultural dialogue, especially the international dialogue, in order to promote and integrate those knowledges which are so important. I would like to ask you, Mirna, how do you think, or what could be the most adequate mechanism to promote an effective intergenerational approach in the dialogue? Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you to all the organizers of this event. I send greetings from the Miskito peoples of the Nicaraguan region, the autonomous northern part of region in Nicaragua. This is a region where we believe in this intercultural dialogue and also intergenerational dialogue. And in that regard, what we have organized is what we know is the intercultural autonomous health model. This was done through a dialogue process which involved all of the indigenous peoples, also the Afro-descendants and also the ethnic communities of the region. But also we did it by ensuring the specific participation of youth. So in order to guarantee or to ensure what in FILAC we know as the educational approach of reconnecting, which means that the older people, those who are the carriers of those the knowledge, traditional knowledge, they can transfer that knowledge to the new generations. So in that sense, I feel that this methodology that has been launched by PAHO today should motivate the different ministries of health in the region in order to ensure not only the respect and recognition to the traditional knowledge and the system of indigenous knowledge, and also the system of traditional knowledge of the Afro peoples that live with us in the communities. But not only that, but also we have to ensure some space where the elderly and also the elders and those who are carrying that tradition can also share it with the new generation. This is new experience that we had from FILAC with PAHO, was in fact the establishment of a master's degree in the area of intercultural health management. And that was done at the autonomous universities of Nicaragua. What was done and what was ensured is that the development of the curriculum of the master's degree program that would take into account the dialogue of different knowledges to incorporate the involvement of the different indigenous peoples who carry that knowledge. And this is important knowledge and experience that we have transferred to other courses that are taught through the Intercultural University. And we have established an intercultural lectures and courses at the university where those people carrying those traditional knowledge will be there on an equal footing with other experts or professors in order to share with the students that attend those courses. So I believe that that experience gives us some important lessons, which is that we really need to ensure a dialogue in the training program of health personnel, but also in the process of drafting health and policies and models in the region. Thank you very much, Mirna, for all your reflections and for reminding us of that interesting experience of PAHO with FILAC in that master's degree program in that intercultural diversity university. This is a time to implement the strategy of the plan of action with equity in the area of health through the indicators that go all the way to 2025, where one of the components is in fact the training issue. I would like to take advantage that we're talking about from the FILAC perspective, and we have Dalia Angela de Magro, who plays a leading role, very important role, when the policy on equity, diversity, and health was launched in 2007, as you may recall. I would like to ask you, what elements do you feel that we need to keep in mind and take into account from PAHO that should be that include the dialogue of knowledges in order to ensure participation of youth and indigenous women? Thank you. Please go ahead. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for allowing me to share this. I feel that first of all, it's very important that we have to start out from the knowledge and the specific knowledge, not only from universities, but also the traditional knowledge of indigenous women and youth, and also to recognize that they are the carriers of age-old knowledge that should be transferred to other generations. And women and youth have made a lot of contribution, not only for sustainable development goals, not only the indigenous territories, but throughout the world. A key central point that here that we can share for us, and we in fact share with the report that we have drafted with FILAC, is the importance of the transference of traditional knowledge through intergenerational dialogue and practices. They see with concern that a lot of the knowledges and cultural elements are being lost because of the loss of transmission. And also it is important that indigenous people can be involved, and they be allowed to be involved and to maintain elements that are sacred in their traditional knowledge. And also because because we have to preserve all of that. So for this reason, I believe it's important to also have a manual for facilitators that would also guide with attitudes and also some main points in order to have dialogue. For instance, gender sensitive issues and sensitive and being sensitive of cultural diversity and traditional diversity, also to ensure full participation of the youth and indigenous women and youth, and also in the dialogue, not only in the content analysis, in the follow-up of work plans, and also evaluation and monitoring. So that will be, that's what our hope is. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bali, for your reflections from the point of view of the program you lead from FILAC. Also, this could lead us to another point, and for those of you who are here and would like to know more about this, in 2017, also in cooperation with FILAC and the Youth Network, the first health plan was launched for indigenous peoples or young people in Latin America. Also, there was another one launched for young Afro-descendant population. It's important for everyone to know, but I believe that the relevant thing about that initiative that was launched in the area of the cultural diversity and adolescent health by PAHO was that the indigenous young people built the plan themselves. They identified their own health priority from the world vision and their own outlook. So I believe it's interesting to refer to this plan because within PAHO efforts, we do have that framework, if you will, to prioritize health systems which have been more relevant among indigenous young people. Also in this regard, to keep in mind the challenges we have faced with the arrival of the pandemic in order to be able to implement this health plan for indigenous young people. I would like to ask Jessica, who also had an important work in this area, and she's a representative of the Coordination for Indigenous Young People. How can this initiative or methodology on dialogues of knowledge that have been proposed by PAHO, how can it contribute to the implementation of the health plan for the indigenous youth of Latin America and the Caribbean? Please go ahead. Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone from the Youth Network. Above all, I would like to send greetings to all of you who have joined us here, and also not only the organizations, but also all the different participants. And picking up on something that was mentioned about 5 years ago, as you said, there has been some monitoring that we have been working on together with organizations such as PAHO, where we were able not only to work together, but also to reflect together and also to give shape to these proposals. Even before the 2030 agenda, we were focusing on taking into account all the different action plans and proposals and actions within our agenda, but also this space made us possible to achieve this outcome in the area of health. One of the issues of the Yala youth is to be able to move from dialogue to action, especially in this area, this space. The problem was highlighted as to the lack of interconnection and in intercultural dialogue, because as it has been said, culture not only involves a physical space, but also harmonious space and also harmony with nature, and including all the collectivity, and also in order to achieve equal and equity results in the area of health. So within those protocols and guidelines for the communities, that's where we can find the solutions that are promised to us by the international commitments by having intercultural focus, but also based on the knowledge, traditional knowledge, and keeping in view the different problems faced by the indigenous communities. The indigenous communities in the Yala also are aware that it's important to know what the methodology, that it's a reflection of, it's a total sum of those traditional knowledge that makes it possible to move ahead in the guarantee of those rights. It's important to recognize that PAHO can help help us implement that methodology in our space. For instance, training of the youth must involve the indigenous young people also and train them in the implementation and application of those methodologies. So it will help them to bring those methodologies and commitments to a reality. And also with having a vision from the point of view of positive results. And this is methodology, and also this information that we are being provided today will certainly help us and will reach all the communities. That methodology in and of itself, we have seen how it is integrated into collective thinking and also by underlying the prior informed consensus, because it's important not only for the young people to be able to have access to the territory, but to build the territory and from the locality, from the point of view of the community. So why we believe the help, in the health plan for 2017, we can see that as a good practice, and indigenous communities are moving ahead and making progress in that regard together with the organizations. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jessica, for your points and for reminding us of the importance of continuing hand in hand with the indigenous youth, as we have also tried to remind everyone it's a priority for you, so we can continue to implement the plan and also to introduce this new proposal for methodology, which is an applicable methodology that is applicable to a different context, and also, of course, to do it together hand in hand with the young people of the region. Also in the area of youth, we can see, and we have worked together with the colleagues of the Andean region. We've had their support, and last year, in fact, we highlighted the importance of continuing to work in order to improve the health of indigenous youth and Afro-descendant youth. I would like to take advantage of the fact that we have Gloria Lagos today here with us, who has been a strategic partner with us in order to implement the initiative of the dialogue of knowledges in the Andean region. I would like for Gloria to share with us at this time, from the post-pandemic context, how have those requests been made by the ministries of health of the Andean region for all of the different webinars and that we have been organizing and that are being implemented. If you can share that with us. Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, kind greetings to everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Allow me to send you the greetings and the best wishes for good success in this meeting from our executive director of the Andean Health Organization. Now, in response to your question, I would like to share with you that the Andean Health Organization has been developing the intercultural work since 2006. This was an initiative that came about from the Ministers of Health, from at the level of directors of intercultural health of each Ministers of Health, which is part of this organization: Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. So also there was a cross-cutting inclusion of all of this in all the programs and plans, but understanding that it would not be possible to resolve all the health problems of the population if we don't know the specific characteristics of each one of them. Let us remember that the Andean region is made up by 6 countries having multiple populations, each one having very rich, age-old traditional knowledge in the area of health and with a very specific view of that. And we don't know that. And if we don't recognize that, then those visions and those knowledge, and if we don't take that into account, taking into account those perspectives and knowledge, they would not be able to close the gap, to be able to become get closer to them and to give them access to help. So started back then, we started developing an Andean policy for intercultural inclusiveness. And this has been developed together with the Andean cultural committee in the area of health. However, in this policy and in our plan, we have underlined the importance of working on this very rich methodology, which is the the dialogue of knowledge, because it's a methodology that facilitates communication, that makes it possible to listen and to be heard, that allows for exchange of experiences. But unfortunately, for one or other reason, and especially because of the pandemic, the last 2 years, we saw the need to postpone that action. But now, in picking up the activities again, the Andean Committee prioritized, once again, resuming the development of knowledge, transfer and knowledge. So that's why we are interconnecting with the office of the PAHO and the WHO regional office, also the regional office in Washington, with whom we have been coordinating this activity. I would like to point out that with PAHO, we have go back a long way in our cooperation, responding to health needs almost from the very beginning. But in particular, in speaking about this intercultural issue with PAHO, we have been working since 2006, and they have been there and provided help to present before the ministers of health and all their views of the indigenous people, and also helped us with the development of the different tools and instruments that we have. So together with the Office from Latin America, ever since its inception and creation, we have headquarters in Lima. We have also been working with them in a coordinated fashion. So those who know of this work and this very significant development that we have with the Office of Ethnicity and the Management of Knowledge, based on that, the committee made a call on prioritizing this action as a first activity for this year. And then what we did was that from each country, a group of people were selected in order to be facilitators in the methodology of knowledges, so we can train them. At the present time, we are developing a workshop or training seminar per country with people that meet the requirements in accordance with the manual we have, in accordance with the education we have for that. So once we complete the training of facilitators, each country will replicate that experience, and we will do a follow-up to that throughout the whole country.
And these knowledge dialogues, or these facilitators, are not only indigenous, but we also include those who work with the Afro-descendant population, because for the ministers of health, this was a priority, that we work with the Afro-descendants, and that we also have a diagnosis of the population of Afro-descendants, and have this information be a part of an intercultural plan of action. So this is what we are working on together with the Afro-descendant population. So beginning with that, we are launching this campaign, which we hope to conclude successfully. Thank you. Thank you, Gloria. A great deal of work is being done in the Andean region. As Gloria mentioned, we are training those who are working with intercultural dialogues, those who have experience within their ministries, and have been working with numerous diversity colleagues that make possible the implementation of this methodology. Gloria also touched on a very important matter: to be able to transfer this work, to be able to replicate it. I know that they did work with the indigenous peoples, but it is also true that the idea is that these methodologies be adapted to other groups who are in a vulnerable situation. I would now ask our colleague Adrian to refer to some of the technical aspects of implementing a knowledge dialogue. A lot of emphasis has been given to methodology and participatory planning. We know that there was a great deal of criticism in the past what happened with the dialogues? What was their goal? What was their purpose? So I would now like to have your thoughts on your experience, not only in Ecuador, but in other countries in the region. I know that you've worked with indigenous peoples as well as Afro descendants. What are the most important challenges, the technical challenges within PAHO if we implement intercultural dialogues? Good morning and thank you to one and all, members of the panel, brothers and sisters who are following us. Well, before going into the subject matter of your question, I wanted to emphasize the importance of dialogue, of intercultural dialogue, especially as in Ecuador today, we're seeing a situation having to do with a social crisis. And there were some protests that were launched on Monday. And here we note the importance of the dialogue and the usefulness of the dialogue. And that cannot be stressed enough. It is highly relevant. Now we're undergoing a very critical situation. And of course, we're in contact with PAHO and the UN system, and we stress the need for having a dialogue. And all of these dialogues also include an intercultural aspect, because with the indigenous people, we've been promoting certain activities as well as certain activities on the part of the government in order to have it set up a dialogue situation so that we can come out of this conflict peacefully. Having said this, and as you well said, Sandra, we've been using the methodology of a knowledge dialogue, and we've been doing that now for a number of years. And we believe that this is a very important tool, especially when we talk about traditional medicine and Western medicine. Now, with our different experiences, we stress the need of going even further than a dialogue. A dialogue is a way of recognizing one another, listening to one another. We need to have a very interested form of listening. We need to understand the different perspectives. We need to understand both forms of medicine. And PAHO has guidelines for this. And how this all needs to be facilitated by someone who has experience. What we're doing now is to define the reason for the dialogue. Yes, we learn from one another, but we also have another challenge as we see it in Ecuador. How can we go even further to reach an agreement so that different practices, say in the health field, as we are talking about that, and how the practices are accepted, and we need to make sure that Western medicine not only goes to the more favored populations. We need to make sure we have these dialogues and a coming together. This is an initial phase. And from there, we need to build a path so that this dialogue leads to concrete agreements. with contributions from both sides, with both sides being in agreement. And we also need to recognize which practices are not the most favorable. So we need to look at both forms of medicine, traditional medicine and Western medicine. And we need to make sure that any suggested practices be appropriate. And after those meetings, we hope we will have a wealth of experience. And this way we will improve the care and health of our people. Thank you. Thank you, Adrián. And thank you for your thoughts on what is occurring in Ecuador today. And so we offer our solidarity from here. And we also see from the methodology how this is a process. We don't just simply remain in dialogue, but we go further. Now, the interest and objective we have is to propose a methodology that will lead to planning. So it's important that all of the appropriate players be involved in order to achieve change. Now, Gloria made reference to the work made with Afro-descendant populations. And we also have Alberto Roca, who is the head of the Department of Inclusion of the OAS. And he's been working not only on the question of indigenous peoples, but also Afro-descendants for many years. And here we need to understand how we can better maximize the cooperation and the efforts among agencies. So could you talk to us about how the OAS can contribute to the work between PAHO and the OAS with your department, as well as with other agencies who are participating, such as the IDB? Thank you, Sandra. And first of all, greetings to the organizers and my colleagues on the panel who are here joining in our reflections. Now, from the perspective of the OAS, what greatly assisted us was the decade for Afro-descendant people. And more specifically, when there was the approval of a plan of action for Afro-descendant people. And this includes specific articles on health, and it makes reference to intercultural health and collaboration with PAHO. Now, as part of the plan of action, there is a mandate to set up inter-American networks, including Afro-descendant populations. So in 2018, we set up Red Afro, which is the Inter-American Network of High Authorities for the policies of promoting Afro-descendant populations in all of the countries of the region. And here it's been very important to talk about health, specifically because of the pandemic. We had two special meetings. The first was to see how, in the framework of the pandemic, we would include Afro-descendant populations. And many of the ministries of health in the region, let us say the majority, did not include a reference to Afro-descendants. So we need to define on what intercultural means, and it is not only indigenous peoples. And we also need to look at all of the different health factors that affect interculturality. We then had another meeting on vaccinations. And this was a very important meeting with PAHO, and we were able to consolidate our collaboration with PAHO within this framework of the pandemic, which is ongoing. But how can we best make sure or ensure that there is the inclusion of the Afro-descendant variable in health and in schools? So here we also need to mention what Sandra said, How can we achieve change? Red Afro, which has all of these different players and authorities who are defining policies for inclusion and for connection and for awareness for all of those decision makers. This is important in order to promote the variable of Afro descendants. And this is what we're working on. And the idea is to continue to consolidate our work with PAHO, but as well as the IDB and academia. And we also continue with exchanges with indigenous peoples, because certainly there's much to do to increase the learning process. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Roberto, for your thoughts and for the work that we've been doing. Now, if we want to strengthen collaboration among agencies, and this is key and of great importance to PAHO, I would ask Jessica, especially since she has worked closely with FAO, and she has covered very important topics for the OAS, and there's much we shouldn't ignore, for instance, climate change. And so we're very much interested in working on this through intercultural dialogues. And we also see the food crisis and the pandemic. How do you see that the different agencies act, and how do you see that intercultural dialogues can contribute to better practices within these contexts today? For instance, climate change, food crisis, etc. Here, I would like to stress the importance of the methodology. We need to look at ongoing education, continuing education, because the indigenous youth today is not only going to the universities, but they are being trained with a new view of human rights. And so where they are trained, where they are educated is very important. It is also important to emphasize the coordination of collective knowledge. This is key, because here, not only are the problems reviewed by the indigenous youth, but they touch on so many different topics, as mentioned today: economic, political, and social systems in our region. Youth also needs to speak of health from a holistic perspective. During the pandemic, youth talked about and needed a space for dialogue, because they have seen the realities regarding so many issues such as climate change, but also they needed to understand how to better confront the food crisis and how this all needs to be related to health and the health of the environment. So the idea is to move forward specifically in the area of health, to have this intergenerational, intercultural, and interinstitutional perspective is very important for all of the agencies, because in this way we can generate actions. And this allows us to speak of problems, because one problem can lead to another, but we can also see good practices, and good practices can promote further good practices. So we need to emphasize the work being done by UN agencies, because we need to share our methodologies, because this can all lead to good practices. To talk about these actions for us within these spaces also means that we need to work collectively collectively. Now, Indigenous youth cannot act alone because then the response would be limited. We need to generate proposals that can be generational. We need to think holistically. Indigenous populations need to have additional knowledge. We also need to stress that we need to have the budgets so that we can implement these key actions in order to protect life. We need collective action. This is a key proposal. And once again, I congratulate PAHO for what they are doing, and also FAO and the World Health Organization, because we're all committed to moving forward. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jessica, por esas reflexiones. Para nosotros es sumamente importante retomar esos temas y desde OPS esperamos, por ejemplo, con el tema de cambio climático es uno de los.
Thank you so much for us. So important, especially one of the topics such as climate change. And in this area, it will be very important to work together with the young people, also in cooperation with the FAO, which is another strategic organization for this cooperation. So we are hoping to be able to broaden these efforts and of course, in collaboration with youth. I would also like to take advantage of the fact that we have Myrna and the FILAC vision as how you have been working in the intercultural approaches, keeping in mind that the technicians and people in the different countries not only working in order to train facilitators for intercultural dialogue, but also to position and implement the methodology that PAHO proposes, which is an adaptable and a methodology that it can be improved and that in the end should be collective methodology. I would like to ask you, what are the actions that are being carried out by FILAC in order to promote knowledge dialogue, and how can we complement or to that initiative? Thank you so much for your question. As FILAC, we position ourselves as a bridge that links together and tries to articulate the indigenous peoples with the governments to promote change, which resolves and in structural problems that are affecting marginalized groups. That means that we position this topic of the dialogue of knowledge as a tool that contributes to making it possible to reach changes. We cannot see the knowledge dialogue disconnected from the framework of human rights. What does that mean? That we do not think either that the dialogue of knowledge will be achieved by only involving certain people, but rather that we need to have communication or dialogue, in this case, between the ministers of health with the local authorities, also the ancestral authorities or elders, and also the carriers of that traditional knowledge. And in that sense, when we are able to articulate the different stakeholders or actors around the table, obviously, the first thing that is required is a will, the will to talk, to respect one another, to accept one another, to listen to different divergent points of view, but the main interest of reaching a common ground. So that's why it's so important for me, what was being said by Gloria, in terms of that the cross-cutting, humanized or human right-based plan as a health policy, because there are interests on both sides. For the indigenous people, we are also concerned about the high mortality rate in the indigenous women. So and also at the same time, on the other hand, ministers of health are also concerned about that, because even though they came up with many policies, they did not really provide the access to Indigenous women to health units. So the first step for dialogue in the area of knowledge is to find a convergence point, common ground, and to accept that both sides or the three sides have valuable knowledge. No one is more scientific than the other. It is a dialogue. It's an intersectoral, interscientific dialogue through which through generations, we have shown that we can provide answers to the health systems and health problems. And obviously, the Western health system has also been working in designing responses in order to reply to the different problems. So intercultural dialogue cannot be proposed or presented as the prevailing system of one system over the other. So, but rather both or the three different systems of knowledge make contributions, and they bring the contributions to the table, to the discussion table. And in that sense, we need to take them into account. I believe that what we have learned is that what we require is a human right-based framework that is individualized and also collective at the same time. We need convergence points. Also, we need to have evidence-based knowledge and the policies from the different stakeholders, and at the same time to understand that dialogue is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process which seeks together to achieve fundamental changes that will ensure this case with a healthcare with dignity with the members, for the members of Indigenous peoples. I believe this is what we have learned. And also the second thing we have learned is that there cannot be any dialogue in relation to knowledge if it's only will from one of the sides. There must be willingness from every side. And we cannot, from our position based on our knowledge, or the Ministry of Health, to decide who we're going to talk to and who we're not going to talk to. That is also determined by the Indigenous people. A dialogue of knowledge will never work when we come up at the last minute with the interlocutor, believing that with that we are fulfilling that requirement for dialogue. Dialogue is only one instrument or tool for the transformation and the overcoming of barriers that have kept Indigenous people from having proper access to the health care systems. And when it comes to the dialogue of intercultural dialogue in the different areas, also involving the different representatives of the different communities and ethnic groups and Indigenous people, because they are the ones that they coexist and they know all the different systems, and the responses must provide solution that would also take into account all those different systems.
Por esas reflexiones, excelentes reflexiones.
Mirna, thank you so much for your excellent points. I think this really puts into context and systematizes the work that has been done by PAHO, because we have really seen how many times the health position was the prevailing position. And from there, we realized that the initiative would not work out. I think we have to pick up that need to consider a human right approach. This is something that we took mentioned yesterday in our meeting on non-transmissible diseases, that sometimes when it comes to technical cooperation, one thing that is not taken into account, that each individual has individual rights but collective rights. So we believe that these reflections are very valuable and useful, especially for PAHO people who are trying to implement this work. I would also, in this context, I would like to ask you, how from PAHO can we strengthen, and what would be your recommendation? How can we strengthen partnerships with the ministers of health, not only between Indigenous peoples and ministers of health, knowing the work that PAHO does in this area as a technical cooperation in this area? What do you think? I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has created an opportunity for this relationship, because the Indigenous people have been able to show in the different countries that by articulating under the different self-government system, whether in isolation or by you applying their own medicinal knowledge, or by enhancing their own potential of traditional knowledge in order to bolster their immune systems, in order to increase the capabilities of the youth, in order to disseminate and publish accurate information in the different languages. So that's an experience that we have gathered during the pandemic, generates evidence which the ministries of health are beginning to recognize. So I believe that if we are able to tap into this opportunity, we could enhance what you already have as PAHO, which is the ethnicity policy with its 5 work guidelines or pillars. Those can be the pillars that will guide us to help us to generate a table for discussion in each one of the countries in order to really be able to take advantage of this opportunity that is presented to us to design or strengthen intercultural health models. I believe that is the role that PAHO can play at this time to enhance that need to articulate, which the ministers of health already have it, but they don't reach all the way to the last community. So the need that we have, the indigenous peoples, that we also need to have access to a technology that we don't have whenever people are isolated or quarantined because they're sick. So we do have a common need and common ground here. And this is where PAHO should really take advantage and implement that methodology. Mirna, those are very relevant, important considerations, especially for the work done for PAHO, even for all the colleagues from the different countries. We definitely look forward to continue to cooperate with FILAC. And I think that this is worthwhile for us to mention a great other partner that we've had, which is the government of Canada, through the integrated health systems of health in Latin America and the Caribbean. And through that, we have been able to work on maternal health, and not only for the indigenous populations, but also Afro-descendant people. Is one of the impact indicators that we have under the health strategy and plan of action and equity and health. And I would like to ask you, Andean, how has been your experience of how have you been building intercultural health with diversity in the area of maternal health at the level of the Canadian program? Thank you so much. First of all, I totally agree with what was said by Mirna on how those processes should be put together. I believe in the case of Ecuador, the previous work that we did within the framework of the Canadian project and with all the different communities and all the different actors set very, very strong foundations so we could make progress in the processes of articulating when the pandemic hit. So in that regard, and by the Ministry of Health in Canada, we really made a lot of progress in the different guidelines and standards that were developed, taking into account intercultural diversity and also taking into account the different mechanisms for dialogue that we were implementing jointly. With all of that made us possible. When we faced the pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic, we already had immediately we had access to a dialogue table in such a way because we already had the foundation. So we went from the having a protocol for indigenous people or ethnic groups to become a protocol involving together working with the different indigenous communities and ethnic groups, because in the construction and the adequacy of the protocol for the management of COVID-19 that was done jointly together with all the groups, all the stakeholders, in order to develop that strategy and the communication strategy that was developed for prevention that was done that way, involving all the actors, and also articulation that were recognized, as Mirna was saying. The linkages were seen not only a very useful thing by linking it to the central offices, but also it was supplemented in a very nice way with all the different efforts that we're making at the health ministries. And also thanks to the previous work that we had done and before the pandemic, in coordination with all the different organizations and through dialogue, we can say that Ecuador is already becoming one of the countries in the region that has made the most progress in vaccination against COVID-19 in those different territories, not only in the building of consensus, but also building trust. And so people will have that confidence. I will be feel more comfortable in getting vaccinated in those vulnerable populations. Of course, the other component, which is also the other partnership components, and even before the pandemic, that's where we placed the most emphasis within the framework of the Canadian Health Services and Ministry of Health of Canada view. In fact, we conducted dialogues with different knowledges. That was a very interesting experience that we had at a binational level with all of the population, and also with the not only with the maternal health and the midwives, and also that we believe in all these communities, that we work together in Peru, also to work with those communities in not only, yes, the Ministry of Health in Peru, but also the midwives, and or rather, they are partners that work with us in the Amazon region. And thus has been the result of a very good, fruitful dialogue. Here, I would also like to mention another very specific aspect or feature that not only we had to work or continue to work in the dialogue between Western medicine and traditional medicine, but also in relation to inter-ethnic dialogues, considering the different ethnic groups and nationalities, which facilitates the work and makes it possible to have a transfer of knowledge. Not only the same people working together with the same knowledge, but rather having an exchange or involving all the different groups, whether in the Amazon, the Andean region, coastal regions, or the rainforest, because from each of those, in those territories, there are different nationalities and ethnic groups that have a different world vision and their own features, characteristics, and that's another path that we had to move along in order to move that intercultural dialogues. Of course, that, and going back to what Mirna was saying here, the importance of considering that this is not a snapshot or a movie, it's an ongoing process. It's not a movie, it is just a first encounter, but it's also, it is fundamental that from the cooperation at the ministry level, we just don't leave it there. No, it is the indigenous groups and the different communities and their organizations that have to identify the different needs and to connect and establish liaisons to have the dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adrian, for your points, especially for the initiatives that are being developed by PAHO even before the pandemic, which are still ongoing. There's something else that I would like to touch upon, and I know we're coming to the end of the dialogue, but taking advantage that we have Roberto Rojas here, I would like to reflect on an issue that nowadays it's very important. And how do we document or evidence, give evidence of the racial discrimination in the health access area? I would like, Roberto, how can this initiative contribute to PAHO? Remember that we have been working in this initiative, working together, when we did it with cooperation with the OAS and the IATRO, and that report reflects the importance of overcoming that, of not only having evidence, that in addition to that, we also have to take into account to other benchmarks, how the population lives. So how that initiative of empowering the different knowledges, how can that help us?
Thank you, Sandra. Well, certainly there's been assistance in terms of the legal framework. There's also the Inter-American Framework Against Racism and all forms of intolerance. We also have the Inter-American Convention against all forms of racism and intolerance. So when we talk about an Afro-descendant population and indigenous population, we need to recognize the diversity of these populations and how these different actions are complementary. Now, we have two specific articles, which is to make sure, to ensure that there are proper statistics. And when the pandemic started, we were able to see in many states that the ethnic racial variable was not included in the data. And this did not allow us to have differentiated information on the Afro-descendant population in terms of their health. But then there is the specific question of prevention and sanction of discrimination. Let us call it racism. But there's also the question of social rights, such as the right to health. So to have this methodology means that we can work on implementation. And here I would appeal to all of the states who are not yet a part of these activities to recognize that in the Americas, there was a pandemic that was prior to COVID-19. And that had to do with racism and intolerance. So this is why it's very important to join these inter-American instruments, especially in terms of their implementation, but it is also important to generate dialogues and instruments that give us a baseline for indicators that allow us to measure discrimination and thus generate public policies to eliminate it. Now, during the 10-year celebration of Afro-descendants and all of this, during the celebration of the 10 years, we generate all kinds of events, and in the collaboration that we have between OAS and PAHO, we can work on questions of the health of Afro-descendant populations. And with the pandemic, we renewed many of our efforts, but we realized that this needs to be an ongoing dialogue because it's been something that's been put aside for too long. So we need to have the dialogues, generate indicators, and also point to the legal frameworks and become fully aware of how we need instruments that will facilitate and promote implementation of the rights of millions of people in the Americas. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Roberto. We're coming to our final minutes, but I have a question for Dali and another one for Gloria. Dali, from the work that you've been doing with youth, how can we strengthen alliances with the ministries of health so they join this perspective, also involving youth, and also from the perspective of the work you do with FILAC? Now, in terms of Indigenous youth in FILAC, we need to listen to them. What are they saying about health? What are their concerns? What are their recommendations? Now, in the third meeting of Indigenous youth, they felt that what was needed to be understood was the holistic approach and how it brings together the spiritual, the physical, the emotional. Indigenous youth feels that there's a lack of an intercultural perspective in health services. In addition, they've identified additional practices which can affect the physical and mental health of young women. And they point to the vulnerability of childhood and youth, especially when they're subject to poverty and marginalization and the different crises that they refer to their identity. Now, by listening to them, we have developed ways of connecting and also for setting up in academia more contents. And so we have a number of Indigenous youth who are also teachers, because when they talk about intercultural, it's not a question of simply teaching the conventional curricula, but they also feel that it is necessary to generate intercultural exchanges of knowledge. Today, what we find is that there are a number of experts within Indigenous communities who are experts in human rights. and they work with the Carlos III University in Madrid and focus on women and indigenous peoples. And this way they bring in young indigenous women leaders. And so they're also preparing a new course for a diploma. Now, in the manual, what is also mentioned is that one needs to learn through knowledge dialogue, but it is also necessary to understand how medicine is understood and how there is complementarity between the two medicines, the Western and the traditional. But they also mention another element which is important, which is to communicate and inform. Knowledge dialogues represent a powerful tool so that all can communicate, learn from one another, and understand other situations and expectations. Certainly the manual will be a very important tool and will assist in the work that we do, but we need to also take account of the experiences of the people, the youth and women. In the manual, we also see that knowledge dialogues also involve a responsibility of sharing, for instance, in the health sector. We need to create an awareness and information on intercultural elements, cultural elements. And what this means that we need to respect the health system of the indigenous peoples, where the knowledge dialogue needs to include the concepts of indigenous peoples and how they see health and sickness. The dialogue of knowledge is not a one-way conversation, but it also needs to involve a political level so that there be concentrated actions by the states so that the realities in terms of indigenous peoples change. So here it is very important that we also work on exchanging information and practices, coordinate activities in favor of indigenous peoples. So this means that we need to support activities already being undertaken by the communities and that also allow us to re-guide state actions focused on youth and indigenous peoples. The program from FILAC joins the efforts of PAHO for strengthening these dialogues of knowledge. We have knowledge and practices which have been proven for finding the best way for a more inclusive world. Thank you. Thank you, Dali, for your thoughts. They are very important. And we will continue working in coordination with FILAC and youth. Now, before going to a final question for all of the participants today, I would like to ask Gloria on the initiative for the Andean region. Now, Gloria, this proposal that we are coordinating technically from PAHO, how will it help the health outcome of the less advantaged groups in the Andean region? Thank you very much, Sandra, for the question. And first of all, I would like to thank everyone for participating. And I would like to mention how we've incorporated interculturality in our work. When the Andean Committee was set up for intercultural health, we had the good fortune of having on the committee representatives of indigenous populations in our country. And there were also those that were not a part of indigenous populations, but who were very much committed to their work and people. The work began with many meetings, exchanging opinions, knowledge, identifying the needs as to how to work, how to reach the population, not from the ministries. What we have is a long background of paternalistic work. And we thought we had the recipe for everyone, the solution for everyone, because they don't know what is best for them. And this is what's good for you. The youth, they don't know what's good for them. This is what they need. And this is what was done with vulnerable populations and also with the LGBT community. So in setting up that intercultural health committee, we understood that if we don't know, we can't work. What we don't know cannot be internalized, cannot be respected or shared. So you can do a great deal of work, full of good intentions, but it will not satisfy the goal. What is the goal? To make sure that every person has his rights respected or her rights respected. So this is a very important tool because we need to define the needs. We have, for instance, diagnosis in medicine. And then we need to do the same when we talk about the Afro-descendant population. We need another diagnosis when we talk about a population that's in voluntary isolation. And so this was very interesting because we've been able to identify what the common interests were. And we thought we were doing interculturality. And when we met with the committee, we better understood that it was not simply understanding the differences, although this is very important, but we also need to have a perspective of interculturality. If we did not capture the spirit of our indigenous populations, we were not talking about traditional medicine. So with all of this baggage of research, analysis, and participation of the members of the committee, we believe that these knowledge dialogues provide an opportunity, as I said, to listen, to be heard, but it is active listening. We often need to unlearn what we know. We need to understand and respect all peoples in all their aspects, the indigenous populations, the Afro-descendants, our adolescent population, our LGBT community, all of these who are in a vulnerable situation, they need to be understood, each and every one of them as being one of us. And I want to indicate how we can strengthen the relationship with the different ministries. We need to sit down with them and understand what they want. We need to understand what their needs are. And we need to make sure that decision makers are given qualified information, clear information, so that we can eliminate any gaps in services and thus contribute to ensuring that all of our rights are respected. And we commit to continuing this work. We're very pleased. We believe that the methodology of knowledge dialogues is very important so that we can reach all of our people and the enormous diversity of people we have to continue, not only with training, but follow-up and monitoring of all of those who are trained to be able to extend this to their countries and make from this an excellent tool and allow for excellent communication. Thank you, Sandra.
Muchísimas gracias, Gloria.
Thank you, Gloria.
Estamos en 2 minutos finales. A mí me
Now,
gustaría
during our
aprovechar,
last 2
este
minutes,
espacio antes de pasar al cierre.
I would like to comment before closing and mention
El día 9 de agosto, Día Internacional
that
de los
on
Pueblos Indígenas,
the
se
9th
destaca
of
el valor de las
August is
mujeres en
International Day of Indigenous Peoples, and it will focus on women and the transmission of traditional knowledge. So here I would ask our panelists to send us a 10-second message that we can share on this. Jessica, we'll start with you. Very brief, so that we can conclude. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would simply remind everyone that these methodologies are set up to visibilize collective views. So we need to be present. We need appropriate budgets. We need continuing education. We need workshops. We need all of this collective training. So we invite the states to promote these methodologies so that communities and countries can have these actions, collective action, knowledge action, and we wish to participate. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Mirna, any thoughts on the International Day of Indigenous People this year? We're just focusing on women. Now, a dialogue of knowledge always needs to include women who have ancestral knowledge and who have given answers for all of the problems we've had with the pandemic. They must participate. There must be specific mechanisms to make sure that we respect the diversity of indigenous people, those who live in rural areas, remote areas, urban areas, young women, older women. We need to make sure that they all participate. Thank you, Mirna. Dali.
Bueno, creo que sería importante partir reconociendo sus grandes
We need to begin by recognizing their contributions and wisdom. We don't need to begin with the vulnerabilities. Let's begin with the strengths. We always begin with vulnerabilities and poverty, but we need to take into account what they have built. What does health mean for indigenous women? What does health mean for youth? What is sickness for these women? What does it mean? We need to recognize these concepts and this wisdom, and we need to coordinate with them so that there is a cross-cutting dialogue. Thank you, Dali. Adrián, please. Yes, I believe that the role of the indigenous woman is essential. And this allows us all to have intergenerational knowledge, which is shared, but it is also important that the men accompany the women in this process. And especially when we refer to elders. And we need to understand the generational transmission of knowledge. And we need to understand the key role of the woman, but we also need to understand the role of how the men can support the women. Thank you, Adrián. Gloria, do you have a message? Certainly. We can't do anything regarding indigenous populations without them. And we cannot exclude women and we cannot exclude young women, because what we've seen during the pandemic, that youth and adolescents have done so much work in terms of communicating their knowledge to help their people. So let's move forward with the dialogue, with the youth, with intercultural dialogues, because with this, we will close certain gaps and we will also be able to have an intergenerational dialogue in favor of our people. Thank you. Thank you, Gloria. Roberto? First, I would like to remind you that the OAS will have the Inter-American Week on Indigenous Peoples, and we will especially focus on Indigenous women. And the Inter-American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a specific chapter on Indigenous women. And here the idea is to visibilize the contributions they've made and continue to make. And we need to look at the indigenous woman within the context of their diversity. So here we especially wish to visibilize, and we also understand that with the leadership of Indigenous women, we've progressed a great deal when it comes to rights. So we continue to wish to share. Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. We have Freddie Mamami who will close for us, who will conclude for us. Yes, I would like to thank my sister, and I would like to thank the Office of the Pan American Health Organization for Gender and Diversity and Equity, and for launching this methodology and creating a dialogue of knowledge, which has been promoted by PAHO for the indigenous peoples of our continent. We are a culture of dialogue and peace. So within this framework, it is very important to exchange age-old knowledge, which we have inherited in order to prevent disease in our local communities where we live. And we reaffirm the dialogue and the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, as well as scientific knowledge, which is vital for indigenous communities. We emphasize an intercultural approach in order to better recognize health practices, as well as the inclusion of all of these within conventional health systems as a tool, not only for the different health systems, and not only to consolidate a more participatory and equitable system, but to have a fairer and more humanistic world, and that we be in balance with Mother Earth. We need to recall the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People under Article 24 indicates that indigenous people have the right to their own traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices. And they need to protect their animals and plants that contribute to health. So they have their own fundamental view in their life perspective. And I thank you for this invitation. We've created dialogues and synergies so that we can continue to work. Thank you very much. From La Paz, Bolivia. Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to our colleague from the OAS, John Fernandez, who is in charge of the section on indigenous peoples, and we hope to also work with PAHO and FILAC, a strategic ally. But I now give the floor for the final closing and for you to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. It's been a pleasure being here at this panel. Thank you. Thank you so much to PAHO for the invitation, Adrian, Sandra, and everyone, Freddie, Dali, Myrna, and of course, all the colleagues and participants from OAS. Well, it is difficult because the dialogue has been very interesting and most of the aspects have been covered. Perhaps I would underline some ideas here, take away points. The importance for us to consider knowledge, the traditional knowledge or oral knowledge in the same as relevant and as important as written language. There are many people that communicate and transfer their knowledge orally, not necessarily in writing. So many organizations and the academia sometimes have a negative view, not only not taking into account those views or those traditions of the different communities. They have an oral tradition. So we have to think about all the thinkers of the world. They didn't leave anything in writing. They left oral testimonies, things that later on became part of the important philosophies or history. So it is obvious that in the intercultural dialogue, it's very important to reinforce all of this. And of course, you can count on FAO for this endeavor. Here we are congratulate PAHO on this methodology, which is very important because one of the challenges and difficulties in working with scientists is how they consider somehow something that has been characterized in terms of methodology. That's significant because it's a way to achieve that knowledge, acquire that knowledge, but also to launch mutual mechanisms for mutual respect and mutual recognition. From the FAO, we have been working not only with FILAC and PAHO. We, in fact, did very important work in all the area of ensuring that all indigenous knowledge will be taken into account throughout the healthcare system, not only the medical aspect, but also economic recovery aspects, and everything that has to do with the dialogue of not only cross-cutting vertically and horizontally, transfer of knowledge. We're doing that through the global hub to exchange or transfer of information, of indigenous information. And one of the things that have come about this is the importance, the relationship between good nutrition, health systems, biodiversity, climate change, and medicine. So it is very important for us to continue to cooperate with the indigenous culture and indigenous women. Most of the inhabitants of the planet are women, so it will be unthinkable to do things without putting women at the center. There will be a blunder not to put indigenous women, and not only the older but younger indigenous women at the center, but to give them the opportunity to enhance, amplify the knowledge that has been transferred to them from previous generations. From the global hub, we would like to cooperate with you. Aramar is really pushing and working very, very strongly in the health area together with the environment and nutrition. And we believe that this methodology will be very useful to support this process. There are two other areas that I would like to mention, and they have to do with indigenous youth and also with the comments made by Angelica and Liana. There are two options that we'd like to explore jointly with you. The first one is, as part of the coalition of the ancestral indigenous systems, which is being promoted by a pilot project of the indigenous brothers and sisters, the indigenous pillar is fundamental, and we would like to continue working with this methodology within the framework of the coalition. Also, another important thing is at the Forum of the United Nations for Indigenous Culture. We're already thinking for 2023, having this event, and we are hoping that attendance will be higher than previously, and that it will involve more youth participating from throughout the region. Finally, I would like to say that in October, just about after the Food Security Committee and of the National Food World Day, there will be a new edition with the World Food Forum, which has a very strong participation of young people. And we would like to hear Sandra, Adrian, colleagues, and Myrna, whether it will be useful for us to present that methodology or not, because it could be structure or framework for collective building together, so we can put an end to that mentality that whatever is being given orally is not scientific. I believe that Dr. Myrna explained it very well. There are two ways to do science. One is to the hypothesis, trial and error, and the other one is through observation and the collection of acquired knowledge during observation. That's how many of the indigenous peoples of the world project and transfer their scientific knowledge. I would close by saying that in 2001, and thanks by the joint work, for the first time, a scientific committee recognized the contribution of indigenous knowledge in the area of nutrition as revolutionary, contributing to resiliency, and that came about from the different fora and dialogues that were organized, including all the different communities, which something before were excluding millions of people in the world. So this will lead to some policies. Sometimes policies are not only sustainable because they're not well developed, but they're not sustainable because they have not been inclusive, taking into account all the stakeholders. Myrna explained that how the dialogue process is not only one sporadic consultation, a one-time thing, but it is to put the rights of the indigenous peoples in the center of the decision-making, especially in the decisions that affect humanity. We can see that on the outside of the COP, Conference of Indigenous Peoples are not invited to those impact evaluation committees or discussions on environmental committees, and that means that would lead to insufficient or incomplete environmental policies. I would like to take any more of your time just to tell you that you have a partner here in us as in FAO and the indigenous peoples in order to promote this methodology, not only to have an exchange of knowledge, but also to do public policy. So it will be complete and comprehensive and inclusive, keeping or putting women in the center, indigenous women in the center. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and have a good day, everyone.